On October 23rd through the 25th, approximately 500 huge nerds descended on the town of Alexandria, Virginia, to attend the largest gathering of Clojure enthusiasts anywhere in the world. The event consisted of 3 days worth of talks, community, and unsessions, as well as a bunch of much smaller community meetups, dinners, and hangouts. I was fortunate enough to be able to go this year, so I packed my bags and hopped on the Amtrak to Alexandria, Virginia. I paid for everything myself to attend the conference, which included a $550 entry fee, over $1,200 for 4 nights of hotels, and the Amtrak ticket down from New Jersey, which, thank God, only cost $130. On Wednesday morning, I arrived at the official hotel for the conference, the Westin Old Town Alexandria, to drop off my luggage at the front desk before the big day. At this point, I didn't have a room yet, so I was just kind of wandering around the lobby, waiting for the conference to start. But while I was stumbling around, I stumbled on some people who might be attending the same conference that I was. I'm not usually good at striking up a conversation with strangers, but I walked over and they were super friendly. I've been working in Clojure mostly on my own for the past 2 years, and after only talking online and on forums, it was just really nice to meet people in person and get a sense for what tools they were using and how they were doing things. For me, these conversations were far and away the most important part of the conference. I learned so much from them, and I'll share those insights more in detail later on in the video. On Wednesday, the officially scheduled activities were the Unsessions, talks, workshops, and discussion sections that kind of felt like sitting around a bonfire and singing Kumbaya. The sign-up process for making one of these was literally just a spreadsheet, and everything about it was just designed to be super chill and informal. I actually signed up to give an unsession to air out my grievances with refactoring in Clojure, and it got accepted to be an official unsession. This was my first Clojure Conj, so I didn't really know what to expect, and I was super nervous about it, and I really wanted it to go well. So even though I attended some of the other sessions, I really spent most of the day thinking about and preparing for my own session. Thankfully, they scheduled me for the last section of the day, so I got to see how some of the other sessions worked out before I had to run my own session. I also reached out over Discord and got some really useful feedback of just like what to expect and what I should prepare for as a moderator. The other unsessions that I did attend were the holy grail of web development, lightweight UIs for your editor in Cursive, and an unsession on the Biff Web Framework. Now, I didn't find most of these useful, mainly because I don't use Biff and I also don't use Cursive. I thought some of the ideas actually in the Cursive session were really interesting. And coming from a text-only environment, it was really interesting to see how people were making use of visual tools to really get the most out of their editor. Kind of the main idea was to use these IntelliJ-style visual pop-ups to create these kind of unique experiences. And it got me thinking about how Emacs is lacking a lot of these like visual tools, especially for this more like charts and graphs and interactive sciencey types of applications. I remember actually talking with someone after the conference, and he kept insisting over and over again that the tools that Mathematica had for just like visual programming and interaction with charts and graphs and kind of melding that with software was miles ahead of anything that any other editor had to offer. So I'm super interested to investigate those claims and sort of check it out. The Holy Grail of web development was one of these sessions that I think had the promise to be really interesting, but was kind of oversold a little bit for what it actually was. So basically, there were these 2 guys that wanted to build one specific type of application, which is a collaborative editing application in the style of like Figma or like Google Drive or something like that. And they basically wanted fast sort of client-first local updates, but also kind of synced everything with multiple users viewing the same document or the same project to get this kind of client-first that also syncs with a shared backend. And so later in the conference, there was another talk, the InstantDB talk, which was basically a 40-minute explanation / answer to this whole problem. And I guess it was only like one proposed solution to this problem, but it's something that, funnily enough, they had already thought through in a lot of detail, specifically in Clojure, and kind of proposed an answer to this problem. Something that was kind of neat though is just from kind of the roundtable discussion in the unsession, a bunch of the other engineers kind of recognized that this could be potentially framed as a database problem and actually proposed solutions that were really similar to the ideas of InstantDB. Next up, I hosted the refactoring unsession, which I basically proposed to complain about all my problems trying to refactor stuff in Clojure and to ask the community for help. In particular, I have just a really hard time nailing down Clojure objects and data structures. in a way that makes it easy for me to find all references, especially when dealing with things like single keyword record access, or understanding what multi-methods need to be defined on a new data type. I think what I really want is some sort of like little bit of type system for Clojure. And even though there are a bunch of options, I feel that there's nothing that all the way meets everything that I want to use it for. In addition, I use a lot of the Clojure refactoring tools. And sometimes for me, for whatever reason, they just like don't work right. Like I'll tell Emacs to rename a variable with LSP mode, and sometimes it'll work and it'll find all the references and do everything correctly. But sometimes it'll mangle a namespace definition or only find some of the references. And when I'm using it, I don't feel like I can rely on it fully. And so I brought this up and I asked about it for discussion. And it just seemed like most of the people there just like didn't have these problems at all. Like everybody there was like, yeah, man, I use LSP mode and I do renaming variables and I do refactoring and it works fine and it works great for me. So like, I don't know, maybe I'm just doing something wrong, but it was actually really good information just to know that like other people didn't have these problems that I apparently seem to be having. And maybe the problem was with me and like how I'm using these tools and interacting with them, rather than the tools themselves. So it gave me some like information of like where to look next, and that like maybe I should be kind of using the same tools, but just like figuring out how to make them work better and how to like use them better. I also brought up my problems with Clojure records, and they were like, bro, like nobody uses Clojure records. Or I mean, I'm sure some people do, but I think the common pattern for large and complex applications is to use maps with double keyword record access. So you have these guarantees that everything is used in the same way and you don't get these sorts of collisions. At this point, the room had addressed kind of the major things that I wanted to talk about, and they seemed kind of done with it, but there was still 30 minutes left in the session. But luckily, I came prepared. I moved the discussion a little bit, and I wanted to talk about the big problems. You see, based on my experience working at Google and Facebook, I know that there are these certain problems that you run into when you try to maintain a code base that reaches a certain type of scale. And managing that type of ecosystem creates this whole new class of problems that I don't know if the Clojure ecosystem really knows how to deal with. Like kind of for most Java code bases, the standard public, private, protected is pretty good for managing visibility and ownership. But as soon as you get these like massive code bases, understanding visibility and ownership is something that you have to think through a little bit more carefully. As your code base grows, you have to be a lot more thoughtful about enforcing consistency and kind of understanding the structure of your code in a more automated way, especially if you want to do things like make large-scale changes or really build tools that operate on top of your code base. I'm not going to go over the answer to every discussion question in a lot of detail just to keep this video flowing. But if there's enough interest, I'll make a more detailed video going over refactoring tools in Clojure and really give a more detailed summary of everything that I learned. I also want to in particular give a shout out to Cam Saul and Peter Stromberg for bringing really interesting ideas to the refactoring session. I noticed there is a really high correlation between kind of people who had really interesting ideas and people who are working on really interesting projects, or at least projects that were interesting to me and ideas that were interesting to me. I know everybody has different tastes, and I don't know, that was just a really cool and really interesting thing I experienced throughout attending the conj. After the refactoring session, we left the venue and we all went out to dinner. Luckily, and this was really nice, the refactoring session was the last session in the day, so everybody just left from the refactoring session to go to dinner, which means that I got to have dinner with a bunch of the people who I was talking at the refactoring session with. And dinner was great. Dinner was just a great time. I feel like these kinds of experiences of just walking around and talking to people were far and away the best parts of the conj. Like I learned so much just by like listening to people, just even like hearing what kind of tools and what kind of things they were working with day to day, like things that are probably super mundane to them, were just eye-opening to me and really understanding like how people are thinking about their work with Clojure. It was also just a good time, and I met a lot of really fun and really interesting people. At this point, a bunch of people were going out after, I think to see the Lincoln Memorial. But at this point, I was pretty tired, and I went back to my room and crashed out and went to bed. For Thursday, the schedule was split into 2 tracks. So basically, at any given time, there were 2 talks going on at the same time. and you had to pick which one you wanted to go to. But in addition, there was a top secret third track, the hallway track, where you basically don't go to any of the talks and you just hang out in the hallway and make conversation. If you've been watching this video so far, you know that I found the hallway track the most fun and the most interesting. But you need to at least go to many of the other talks so that you have something interesting to talk about in the hallway. In particular, there were a bunch of libraries that I had vaguely heard about or kind of like come across once or twice when scrounging around on the internet, but I didn't really have a sense for like how people were actually using them and like why they were so important and why people cared about them so much. So after attending the conj, I'm really excited to check out these libraries, Pedestal, Components, and Polylith. It seems like I didn't really understand how people were building kind of like these really big applications and kind of like organizing these sort of really large industrial scale projects in Clojure. And it seems like these are some of the tools that people are using to kind of get a handle on that larger project organization and kind of clamp down on that organizational and testing complexity. Again, like these were all things where like I kind of vaguely knew about them, but I didn't understand like kind of like how important they were and how they fit into people's like day-to-day workflow and projects until I attended the conj and asked people kind of how they were organizing things and how they were solving all of these problems that I seem to sort of be having. I also got the sense that people were making heavy use of Clojure maps with keyword destructuring as the primary way to model object-like context in their application. And they were doing that alongside schema libraries like Molly and Spec to kind of keep their large data objects well-structured and under control. For a long time, I also had been personally really excited about the type Clojure library. It's something that I used like 10 years ago, starting in college. And it sounded like most people in the community didn't really have a positive experience using it as a production tool, like outside of kind of like a research and programming languages context. And that was something that was kind of disappointing to me because it's a library that I really want to be really cool. And I think it would be really cool if Clojure had this kind of like really well fleshed out type system. But it sounds like people just weren't having a good experience in practice with it and kind of struggling to actually use it as a key component in their production projects. So I guess that kind of disappointed me a little bit. I might try to use type Clojure anyway, because I'm really excited about the idea of it and I really want it to work. But from talking to people, it seemed like Molly is kind of the way to go. There are also a lot of like little bits and pieces that I was excited to try as well. There's this library called Spy, which is used for Clojure testing and debugging, and that solves kind of some of the problems that I had been kind of like doing manually or making like worse kind of scrappy solutions for. So it seems like a cool library that I'm interested to check out and kind of try it. The second thing that I learned is outside of a bunch of small teams and independent cowboys like myself, there's really only a handful of large companies that are actively doing Clojure. And so even though there's this really big ecosystem of like kind of like Clojure developers and, like personal hobbyists and enthusiasts, there's kind of a lot of overlap and interplay between a lot of the companies that are actually doing Clojure in production. Because what happens is, like some Clojure company comes on the market and it goes to hire and, it wants to hire people that have some experience doing Clojure in industry. And then there's like, a few companies to pull from. And so like there's a lot of kind of employees kind of bouncing around between some of the same companies and from some of the same companies that are all kind of like, I guess, like bringing some of the same ideas and the same kind of like architectures and thought processes around throughout the ecosystem to like the different companies that are doing Clojure. So like in some ways, it's a really heterogeneous ecosystem because you have all of these kind of like small and independent workshops and independent developers. But then in some ways, kind of like the community can be really homogenous and kind of like coalesce on these same ideas because it's the same people that are bouncing around from like one kind of big company that's doing Clojure to another big company that's doing Clojure. So it's like a lot of the same kind of thoughts and ecosystems that are in place. And so kind of the main factions, I'm sure there are more, but kind of the main people that I met, there are a bunch of people from Nubank. Obviously, they own and currently maintain Clojure, and they're probably the biggest company that's currently doing it. And then I met a bunch of people from Centripetal Networks and from Guaranteed Rate, which is some other, I guess, like company that's using Clojure. And, those are just the companies that I kind of met the largest number of people from. I'm sure there are, a few others. And so I noticed that kind of a lot of people seem to be really interested in Postgres and Kafka. These are just like two generally popular technologies. So it would kind of make sense that a lot of people would be generally interested in them. But I definitely noticed I felt like more concentrated interest, because a lot of the same people were kind of bringing the same background and the same familiarity with certain technologies to kind of every place that they worked. I also kind of spoke to somebody who was like a hiring manager that was currently, hiring for some Clojure teams. And he kind of mentioned that he was doing the interview process and kind of like interviewing a bunch of applicants, and I guess kind of many of the applicants kind of like came from the same companies, or in some cases like knew each other or like worked on kind of similar projects. So there was kind of this there was kind of the sense that at least in the very corporate kind of software engineering bubble, kind of a lot of the same ideas and a lot of the same people kept kind of bouncing around between the same like 3 or 4 companies. Throughout the rest of the day, I obviously didn't get to go to all of the talks, but the ones that I went to were Transactor performance. So this is mainly kind of transaction performance within Datomic, which is this database that is kind of like this immutable thing that is built on Clojure. Deploying ML models in Clojure, which I actually didn't think was that exciting of a talk. I actually went to it because I spoke to someone that was the manager of the person who was like giving the talk. And so, like a good manager, she was like advertising the talk of her own employee and kind of like hyping it up a little bit. But I didn't think it was that like information dense of a talk. I think it was the type of talk where the ideas could have been expressed in a much shorter, maybe like 10 to 15 minute talk. And it would have been like a really, really interesting and really good, like kind of lightning talk. Next, I attended Building a Sync Engine in Clojure, which was the InstantDB talk, as mentioned earlier. That was the solution to that one guy's problem. And this was actually like a really good talk. I mean, it was kind of like a 40-minute advertisement for InstantDB. So that aspect of it was kind of lame. But the actual talk itself was really well put together just from like a speaking perspective. Like the actual kind of like pace of the presentation and kind of like the organization of the presentation itself was really like well thought out and really well put together and really entertaining to watch. It was slightly lighter on technical details than I would have liked, but I think it still like kind of like communicated the main ideas pretty well and was just like kind of interesting and pretty entertaining to see. RDF and the Future of LLMs was again one of these talks that I thought was kind of interesting, but like it kind of wasn't something that I really vibed with. Like I didn't think I was gonna like be able to kind of take the ideas from it and really like kind of make use of it in a meaningful way. I actually missed a bunch of the talks in the middle because we got back really late from lunch. So like what happened is like the venue, like the George Washington Masonic Temple, is located like at the top of a hill, like very far away from like all of the shops and restaurants. So we basically walked like half an hour to like get to some place to like have lunch. And then it was like, like we were like a group of like 8 people and it like took a pretty long time to, it was like very fun and I don't regret it at all, but it took like a really long time to like, actually like get our orders through and like, finish lunch and then like get a car back to the venue. And it was just like, it took a really long time. Worth it. But considering the distance of the venue, like to the actual lunch options, it might have been good to kind of like have a little bit longer of a lunch break. It's actually kind of funny. We did the exact same thing on Friday, even already like knowing that this was going to be an issue. Like on Friday, we were like, oh yeah, like we have to like plan ahead and like not go too far for lunch and like not spend too long on it so that we can like get back and like not miss any of the talks. And we still like missed a bunch of the talks. I also saw crafting artisanal vector graphics, which was one of these talks, which was like actually just like very, very fun. Like I don't know how well I retained all of the information from the talk, but they made their entire PowerPoint presentation as like an SVG file, and like it was just chaos, but in a very good way. It was actually kind of funny, like going to a programming conference, like how many different artisanal tools there were to create your PowerPoint slides. Like everybody had their own custom bullshit that they were using to run their presentation, and I thought that was kind of funny. Anyway, the last talk was the story of somebody porting Java's math library to JavaScript so that it could be used in like Clojure and ClojureScript. And it was one of these things where like it was a really good talk, and this person did a tremendous amount of work, and you can really see all of the thought and the hard work and the effort that went into it from the presentation. I don't think I got that much that was actionable that I learned that like I could see from the presentation and then take and then apply to some of my own work. But I mean, like, definitely I'm really impressed by all of the work that this person did. And like, you know, like huge kudos for the technical problem that they accomplished. After the first day of talks was board game night, which was the officially sanctioned social event for the conference. Now, as you might expect, the conference was a bunch of huge nerds, so they had every board game imaginable, alongside a little hors d'oeuvres table with a bunch of food and drinks. I went in expecting to play some new or unusual board game, but what actually happened is I just sat down and spent the whole time playing Bughouse. Really what happened is I was only planning to play like one game, but then like I played one or two more, and then by the time I finished, like all of the actual like deep, intense board games had already started. So then I was kind of locked into Bughouse for the rest of the night. But you know, overall a really good time. I think also because this was an officially sanctioned event, you know, all the conference organizers and stuff were there. So if you wanted your moment to talk to Alex Miller or just like whoever in sort of a social setting, this would have been your moment to do so. I didn't because I spent the whole time playing Bughouse, but you know, no regrets. On Friday was the final day of talks, and they had them all scheduled in one room on a single track. Even just from the way they scheduled it, I got the sense that these talks were the main event. And, you know, after going to them, I can confirm that the Friday talks were very good. I went to almost all of them, except for the few that I missed from hanging out in the hallway or coming back late from lunch. On Friday, the ones that I attended were the welcome talk with Rich Hickey, not really like heavy on content, but just like a, hey, welcome to Clojure, we're so excited. But, you know, in kind of a nice way. Immutable values in the big wide world. Which I don't think I really got a lot out of because I'm not super invested in the Datomic ecosystem. And I think I kind of like spaced out a little bit during. I saw real world AI integration, which was one of these talks where I actually had the opportunity to speak to Corinne Meyer during the event. And, you know, I really wanted to like this talk because, I don't know, I just had like a really good conversation with her, and she's like a really smart and really like nice and really interesting person. But I didn't really like this talk that much. It was one of these talks where I think it had some interesting concepts, but I didn't walk away from it feeling like I had learned a lot of like meaningful, applicable information. Next up was the scientific Clojure talk, which I thought was just like absolutely cracked. Like it was so interesting just because the scientific Clojure community is doing so much work and doing so much good work that just like hearing a report of everything that they've done in the past like year or two was just like action packed, exciting, like kind of full of neat ideas and adventures. I actually, in particular, was really excited because they announced Mathematica support in Clojure, which is really huge, in part because like Mathematica is a really important scientific tool, but also like I really like the way that the Clojure ecosystem is going in terms of interoperability with other languages, particularly alongside libraries like libpython CLJ and the whole Clojure script ecosystem. And I think Clojure is really well positioned to be kind of this meta language that glues a lot of different pieces together. And so I'm excited to see so much good work being done on that. Next up was Cam Saul's talk, getting 50,000 companies on board with Clojure. And I thought this talk was absolutely phenomenal, like both in terms of content and also in terms of presentation style. It was just like a joy to watch, and I learned so much from it. I'm especially excited by the way that he's using CLJ condo linters to really enforce constraints and clamp down on the complexity of managing a large code base. This was actually one of those talks where I missed the first part during lunch, and then I went back to watch the videos later because like I really wanted to watch the whole talk from start to finish. The second to last talk, Teaching Clojure Together, was this kind of like heartwarming talk of like, you know, somebody that was kind of new to programming that like got into the Clojure ecosystem and like, you know, had a really good experience with like the ecosystem and the community. And it was just like, you know, a really like nice, like good feeling talk. It was kind of interesting to me as like a Clojure educator also to see like kind of like how somebody else is doing it and kind of like thinking about a lot of the same problems that I've also been thinking about. Something that's kind of funny is this girl wrote a book with Alex Miller, and her name is Jordan Miller, but they're like totally unrelated. They just like both happen to have the last name Miller, which I did not realize when that book came out. But I don't know, I just thought it was kind of funny. And then last up, finally, was the keynote presentation by Alex Miller himself. For those of you who don't know, Alex Miller is kind of like the current lead maintainer of Clojure. So he's like the person who picked up the reins after Rich Hickey and is now kind of like chief in charge of the Clojure ecosystem. So this talk, Design in Practice, was actually a reference to last year's keynote talk, Rich Hickey talk called Design in Practice, where basically he took the ideas from that talk. So he took the ideas of design in practice, and he explained how he applied them in practice to design a new feature for the Clojure language. Now, this was one of these talks where the first time that I watched it, I was like, oh, like he's just saying a bunch of things that are like really obvious. I kind of felt like I was watching one of those like business school presentations where you just like sit in a lecture hall and somebody that's like really good at business just tells you a lot of really common sense things like make sure your customers like your product and test it out before you commit to it fully. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was a really clean and concise framework for thinking through the types of problems that he wanted to accomplish. And even though there were a lot of kind of obvious steps, in practice, most people don't actually sit down and do those steps in a correct and careful and meaningful way. And just seeing how he actually like applied those principles carefully on a real problem and like actually did all the steps. Like it's one of these talks where when I first watched it, it felt like he didn't say anything at all. But then the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized how helpful it was and how much I could actually benefit from applying these ideas to some of my own design problems. So yeah, the videos of these talks are actually all online. If I could recommend like 2 talks that I think are absolutely worth seeing, I would watch Design in Practice and Getting 50,000 Companies on Board with Clojure. I also thought the scientific Clojure talk was very, very good. And yeah, just overall, I had a really great time attending the conj. Just like a ton of really nice, really awesome people. Just like want to give a big thank you to the Clojure community for just like being really welcoming and being really supportive. I don't know if I'll be able to go in future years just because like it was pretty expensive And it was a lot of money to pay out of my own pocket, especially for like hotels and stuff. But as like a one-time experience, I'm really glad that I went, got to see what it was and feel what it was like to be there. And yeah, I just had a really great time and learned a lot as an engineer. So thanks so much for watching. Obviously, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.